Imagine a man with no crown, no army, no noble blood. A man born into chains, forced to fight for the amusement of others, expected to die nameless in the sand. And yet, that very man would rise to become Rome's greatest nightmare. His name was Spartacus. How does a slave, armed with nothing but raw courage and sheer will, bring the most powerful empire of the ancient world to its knees? How does a single spark of defiance ignite a fire that consumes legions, terrifies senators, and shakes the foundations of a republic built on conquest? This isn't just the story of a gladiator. It's the story of resistance against impossible odds. A tale of blood, hope, betrayal, and an undying thirst for freedom. And by the end you might ask yourself, was Spartacus truly defeated, or did his rebellion plant an idea Rome could never kill? Before we dive in, if you love history told with grit and heart, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with a friend. It helps us bring more epic stories like this to life, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Who was Spartacus before he became the name that shook Rome? To answer that, we have to leave behind the marble temples and bustling markets of Italy and head east, to a rugged land of mountains, forests, and fierce tribes, Thrace. Thrace was a place the Romans never fully tamed. Its people were known as warriors, proud and stubborn, men who grew up wielding spears and surviving harsh winters. From this soil came a boy who would later be remembered as Spartacus. Yet here's the irony, Spartacus probably wasn't even his real name. Romans had a habit of renaming their captives. A man from Thrace? He'd be called Spartacus. A Greek? Maybe Greekus. A Syrian? Syrianus. To the Romans, it didn't matter who you were. Your identity was erased, replaced with a label that reduced you to property. So even his name, the one etched in history, carries the weight of slavery. But this Thracian wasn't just another barbarian plucked from the borderlands. According to the historian Plutarch, Spartacus was not only possessed of great spirit and physical strength, but also more intelligent and more civilized than might be expected of his country. He wasn't the crude, savage figure Romans liked to imagine when they spoke of conquered peoples. He was sharp, observant, and in many ways closer to Greek culture than the tribal stereotype. So how did a man like that end up in chains? Here's where the trail becomes murky. Some ancient sources suggest Spartacus once fought for Rome, as part of its auxiliary forces, foreign soldiers recruited to serve alongside legions. If that's true, then Spartacus may have trained with Roman discipline, learned their tactics, and marched under their banners. Imagine the irony. Rome may have taught him the very skills he would later use against them. But something went wrong. Did he desert? Did he rebel? Was he betrayed? The details are lost to time. What we do know is this: Spartacus was captured, tried, and condemned. And his punishment wasn't just chains, it was a fate considered worse than death. He was sold into slavery and sent to one of the most brutal places in the Roman world, the Gladiator school. Now, when we say school, don't think of classrooms or lectures. A gladiator school was closer to a prison camp, a factory of violence. The one Spartacus was sent to in the city of Capua was run by a man named Lentulus Batiatus. Here, men were trained not for life but for death, conditioned to fight and entertain roaring crowds in the arena. Picture the scene: long corridors lined with barred cells, the clang of iron, the crack of whips, and the constant smell of sweat and blood. Every morning, slaves were dragged out to train with wooden weapons, pitted against one another under the eyes of instructors who treated them less like men and more like animals to be sharpened into killers. Most of these gladiators were criminals, deserters, or prisoners of war. Broken men. But Spartacus was different. His soldier's body and sharp mind quickly set him apart. And something else made him stand out: his charisma. Even in captivity he had a presence. Others listened when he spoke. Even the fiercest gladiators, men hardened by chains and cruelty, respected him. While others lived from fight to fight, Spartacus thought ahead. He studied the guards, the routines, the weak spots. He built quiet alliances in the shadows of the barracks. Piece by piece he began weaving the threads of an idea so dangerous, it bordered on madness: escape. But think about it. What chance did they have? Dozens of unarmed slaves watched day and night, surrounded by Roman authority. The arena itself was designed to crush the spirit, a place where death became a spectacle, where resistance seemed pointless. Yet Spartacus refused to accept that fate. And maybe that's the most striking thing about him. Where others saw inevitability, he saw possibility. Where others bowed their heads, he lifted his. He wasn't content to survive for the amusement of others. He was planning something larger. But let's pause for a moment. Imagine being in his sandals. You're a slave owned by men who see you as nothing more than a body to be used, discarded, or killed for fun. You've been beaten, starved, humiliated. And yet you dare to think, what if we fought back? What if we were more than this? That thought, that tiny, dangerous thought, is where revolutions are born. And in the grim walls of Capua's gladiator school, that thought was spreading. Spartacus wasn't alone. Other men too dreamed of freedom. Crixus, a massive Gaul whose strength in combat was legendary, and Ennimaus, a fierce warrior with the discipline of a soldier. Together they began whispering, planning, waiting for the right moment. Because if they tried and failed, the punishment would be unthinkable. Torture, crucifixion, a slow and public death designed to terrify others into submission. The stakes could not be higher. But to men already living with death as a daily shadow, the choice was clear. Better to die fighting than to live kneeling. It was a gamble, a spark waiting to ignite. And in the year 73 BC, that spark would finally explode. Armed with nothing but scraps, blades stolen from kitchens, and the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, Spartacus and his companions made their move. But that moment, the escape from Capua, is a tale in itself. A tale of fire, steel, and impossible courage. And it is there, in blood and chaos, that Spartacus would step fully into history. Because the gladiator who was never supposed to matter was about to lead the greatest slave rebellion Rome had ever seen. The year was 73 BC. Inside the grim walls of the gladiator school in Capua, tension had been building like a storm. Dozens of men, slaves, prisoners, the condemned, trained daily, their bodies sharpened into weapons, their minds beaten down by fear. And yet, behind the silence, something dangerous was stirring. Spartacus had been watching, waiting, planning. He knew the routines. When the guards ate, when the gates closed, when the weapons were stored away. He knew the temperaments of his fellow gladiators, who could be trusted, who might break under pressure, who hungered most for freedom. Slowly, carefully, he built a secret brotherhood within those walls. At his side stood two men who would become legends in their own right. Crixus, the towering Gaul, whose sheer physical strength made him a terrifying presence in the arena. And Ennimaus, another gladiator of immense skill and discipline, respected even by those who feared him. Together, the three became the backbone of a conspiracy that seemed impossible. A mass escape. But what could they use as weapons? The armories were heavily guarded. The gladiators were shackled to training tools, forced to practice with wooden swords, never given real steel unless they were marched into the arena under heavy guard. To break free they needed an edge. And when no weapons were given, they turned to the kitchen. Knives, spits, cleavers, anything with a sharp edge became a tool of war. Imagine it, men trained to fight like professional soldiers, now clutching ladles and meat hooks as if they were swords. It was madness. But desperation makes even madness a kind of logic. And then came the day. 70 men. 70 gladiators who had decided that death in the open was better than life in chains. They launched their plan with the kind of ferocity only born of desperation. First, the guards. Taken by surprise, they were no match for fighters hardened by endless training. Within minutes, the gladiators had killed their captors and forced open the storerooms. Inside lay the treasure they needed most: real weapons. Swords, spears, shields. The tools of Roman war now in the hands of slaves. The prison erupted into chaos. Some men hesitated, terrified of what would come next. Others fought like cornered wolves, driven by pure rage. But when the dust settled, one thing was clear: the impossible had happened. Spartacus and his companions had escaped. Picture the scene: dozens of men rushing through the streets of Capua, armor hastily strapped on, blades gleaming in the sun. Behind them, the shouts of panicked guards. Ahead, the open road. Freedom was not yet theirs, but for the first time it was within reach. Of course, Rome would not let them go so easily. Word of the escape spread like wildfire, and local magistrates quickly scrambled to respond. Small units of soldiers were dispatched to hunt the fugitives down. To Roman officials, this wasn't yet a war. It was a nuisance, an outbreak to be crushed quickly before it spread. But Spartacus understood something Rome did not. This was no longer about survival. This was about resistance. And as the small bands of soldiers closed in, the gladiators proved just how dangerous they could be. Armed now with real weapons, battle-trained, and driven by fury, they cut through the poorly organized Roman detachments with shocking ease. One group of soldiers after another fell. Each victory brought more supplies, more arms, and, most importantly, more followers. Because word traveled fast. Enslaved people across the countryside heard the whispers. Gladiators had broken free, killing their masters, defying Rome itself. To those trapped in servitude, it was like hearing of a miracle. And they began to run. From villas, from farms, from workshops. Shackled men and women slipped away into the night, seeking the banner of Spartacus. Within weeks, what had started as 70 fugitives swelled into hundreds, then thousands. They weren't all trained fighters. Many were peasants, shepherds, runaway slaves armed with little more than sticks or farm tools. But numbers mattered. And Spartacus knew how to turn numbers into power. He led them to higher ground, retreating to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. From up there, they had a vantage point over the plains of Campania, watching the Roman troops gather below. To the Romans this was a simple trap. Surround the mountain, cut off supplies, starve them out. To Glaber, the praetor sent to deal with them, it must have looked like an easy victory. But Spartacus was never easy. In the dead of night, his men braided ropes from vines, lowering themselves down the steepest cliffs where no guard expected movement. One by one they descended silently, slipping past Roman sentries, until they reached the camp from behind. And then, like a storm breaking, they attacked. The Romans never saw it coming. Soldiers were cut down in their sleep. Chaos tore through the camp. By morning, the mighty army that had been sent to bottle up a group of runaway slaves lay in ruins. And Spartacus's rebels? They were stronger than ever, armed now with captured Roman equipment, their confidence soaring. Think about that. A slave revolt, not just surviving but annihilating a professional Roman force. It was unthinkable. To the Senate, it was more than an embarrassment. It was a threat. A crack in the foundation of Rome's authority. And Spartacus knew exactly how to exploit it. With every victory his legend grew. With every mile more men and women joined. This wasn't just an escape anymore. This was war. But war brings questions. Where should they go? How should they fight? For Spartacus the vision was clear. Freedom lay beyond Italy. If they could march north, cross the Alps, they could scatter back to their homelands, Thracians, Gauls, Germans, free forever from Rome's reach. Yet not everyone agreed. Many, like Crixus, wanted revenge. Why flee when Rome itself lay within striking distance? Why not take their fury to the cities, to the villas, to the masters who had tormented them? That conflict of vision would soon tear at the heart of the rebellion. But for now the cause was united by something stronger than strategy: survival. From Capua's kitchens to the slopes of Vesuvius, Spartacus had turned desperation into victory. And Rome, bruised and humiliated, was only just beginning to realize the scale of the fire it had failed to put out. The slave who was never meant to be more than a footnote in the sands of the arena was now commanding thousands, with entire legions on the horizon. And as his army marched across Italy, looting towns, freeing slaves, and defeating every force sent against them, one question began to echo even in the Senate halls of Rome. Could Spartacus, a slave, a nobody, actually bring the Republic to its knees? Rome prided itself on order, on discipline, on control. For centuries, the Republic had crushed rebellions, conquered kingdoms, and imposed its will on the known world. To the Senate, the revolt of Spartacus was supposed to be nothing more than a blemish, a nuisance to be wiped away with a single show of force. But what happens when the nuisance keeps winning? By now, Spartacus's band of fugitives had grown into a swelling army. From the original 70 gladiators, their numbers exploded into the tens of thousands. Slaves fled estates in droves, peasants abandoned their farms, deserters from Rome's own legions slipped into the ranks. Some carried swords. Others carried sickles, clubs, even sharpened sticks. But together they formed a tide Rome could no longer ignore. Yet sheer numbers alone weren't enough. A mob cannot defeat legions. But under Spartacus this mob began to change. He reorganized them, imposing structure where there had been chaos. He arranged men into units, established leaders, and created a chain of command. He trained them not just to fight as individuals, but to move as an army. Some accounts even say he forbade the hoarding of gold and silver, insisting that only iron mattered, iron for weapons, iron for survival. It was a radical idea. These weren't bandits looting for riches. They were an army built on the promise of freedom. And it worked. Rome's first serious response came with two praetors, Publius Varinius and Lucius Cassinius. Each commanded thousands of troops. They were confident, perhaps overconfident. After all, what were they facing? A horde of runaway slaves. No match for the steel of Rome, or so they thought. But Spartacus wasn't playing by Roman rules. He struck quickly, exploiting weaknesses, ambushing smaller units before they could join together. When Cassinius marched with his men, Spartacus's forces swarmed and overwhelmed them. The praetor himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing on horseback while his soldiers were slaughtered. Verinius fared no better. Spartacus captured his lictors, the official bodyguards that symbolized a magistrate's authority, and even seized his horse and insignia. Imagine the humiliation, a Roman praetor stripped of his honors by slaves. Each victory was more than a military triumph. It was psychological warfare. Rome's aura of invincibility was cracking. Ordinary Romans watched in shock as consuls and commanders were bested by men they considered beneath human dignity. And for the enslaved across Italy, the message was electrifying: resistance was possible. The numbers swelled again. 40,000. 50,000. Then more. By some accounts, Spartacus now commanded over 70,000 men. Not trained soldiers, not disciplined legionaries, but a force so vast that even Rome had to admit it was facing a war. And here's the thing: Spartacus wasn't leading a reckless mob. He was thinking like a general. He positioned his army strategically, fortified camps, and used terrain to his advantage. At Mount Vesuvius, he had already shown how creativity could outmatch conventional tactics. Now, across southern Italy, he turned those lessons into a pattern. Every time Roman forces tried to corner him, he slipped away. Every time they divided their troops, he struck with precision. His army moved fast, carrying only what was needed. This wasn't an undisciplined horde, it was a lightning storm, striking wherever Rome was weakest. But Rome was learning too. Defeat after defeat began to sting. Senators grumbled. Citizens whispered. Was this revolt not just a local outbreak but a true threat to the Republic itself? And yet, as the fear grew, so did the rebellion's internal tensions. Spartacus, with his soldiers' discipline, envisioned a long-term strategy. March north, cross the Alps, scatter the army into their homelands where Rome's reach was weak. Freedom lay beyond Italy. Survival lay beyond Italy. But not everyone agreed. Crixus, his Gaulish ally, wanted revenge. Why flee, he argued, when Rome itself was ripe for plunder? Why let the masters live when justice, brutal, bloody justice, was within their grasp? Many followed his call, driven by rage rather than strategy. The divide would soon tear at the rebellion's strength. But for now, Spartacus pressed on. His army clashed again with Roman legions, not once but multiple times. Each battle added to his legend. Each defeat humiliated Rome further. Think about it. A republic that had crushed kings and conquered nations was now being mocked by a Thracian slave. Senators began to panic. The slave revolt was no longer an embarrassment. It was a crisis. And yet, with every victory, Spartacus faced a dilemma. His army was massive but also fragile. These were not professional soldiers bound by discipline and pay. They were men and women bound by hope and desperation. Some fought for survival, some for vengeance, some simply for plunder. Keeping such a force united was like holding a storm in your hands. Still, Spartacus held it together, his charisma and leadership binding the rebellion with sheer will. He had turned fugitives into an army and humiliated Rome at every turn. But he knew deep down that the Republic would not tolerate this much longer. Rome had been embarrassed, but Rome was not yet beaten. The Senate would send stronger armies, led by more ruthless men. And when that happened, Spartacus and his army would face a challenge unlike anything they had seen before. For now, though, the slave general stood triumphant. From Capua to Vesuvius, from southern fields to northern roads, Rome had learned a bitter truth. Spartacus was not a nuisance. He was a storm. And storms, left unchecked, can grow into something that consumes everything in their path. Spartacus's victories had transformed him from a fugitive into a legend. Word of his triumphs spread like wildfire across the Italian countryside. To the enslaved, he was a savior. To the poor, he was a symbol of justice. To the Senate, he was a nightmare that refused to fade. By now, his army had grown beyond anything he could have imagined in those first desperate days. Not 70 gladiators. Not a few thousand runaways. But tens of thousands, swelling into a vast, unwieldy force that rivaled Rome's own legions. The sheer scale was staggering. Ancient sources estimate the army at anywhere from 70,000 to over 120,000 men, women, and even children. Not all were fighters. Many were families who fled with the warriors, carrying their hopes of freedom on weary feet. The roads of Italy filled with a river of humanity, flowing north and south, following the Thracian who had dared to defy Rome. But commanding such an army was no easy feat. Spartacus had discipline. He had vision. Yet he was surrounded by men with different dreams. Some, like Crixus, burned for revenge. They wanted to see Roman villas torched, noble blood spilled, and the landowners who had whipped and starved them crucified in return. Others followed for plunder, gold, silver and the spoils of victory. And still others, weary of war, longed only to escape Italy and return home. It was unity born of desperation, not ideology. And holding that unity together was like trying to bind a storm with rope. Spartacus, however, was determined. He had begun to dream beyond victories. His vision was simple but profound: freedom. To march north, cross the Alps and scatter into Gaul, Thrace and beyond where Rome's legions could not follow. He didn't want to be Rome's destroyer. He wanted to be Rome's escapee. Yet, at every step, the lure of conquest tugged at his followers. Why leave Italy, they asked, when the Republic itself was vulnerable? Why not strike at Rome directly and topple the master instead of fleeing from him? This debate tore at the rebellion's core. In one tragic split, Crixus and a large group of Gauls and Germans broke away, determined to carve their vengeance into the Roman heartland. Spartacus tried to stop them, but unity was fragile, and rage spoke louder than reason. Rome seized its chance. Crixus's splintered force was caught by legions and massacred. Reports say 20,000 died. Their corpses littered the fields, their dreams of revenge drowned in blood. For Spartacus it was a brutal lesson. The rebellion could not survive divided. And yet, despite the setback, Spartacus pressed forward. His forces clashed again and again with Roman armies, and won. He even led his army north toward the Alps, his original plan within reach. Freedom was just beyond those snow-capped peaks. For a moment, it seemed as though escape was possible. But then, a fateful decision. Instead of crossing into Gaul, the army turned back. What? Ancient sources disagree. Some claim Spartacus was persuaded by his followers, unwilling to abandon Italy while victory seemed possible. Others suggest he recognized the risks of dispersing a massive army into foreign lands. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. The rebellion marched south again, back into the lion's jaws. Rome, humiliated and desperate, finally began to treat the revolt as a war. The Senate placed Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ruthless men, in command. Crassus wasn't just rich. He was ambitious, cold, and determined to succeed where others had failed. He poured money into raising legions, training men, and drilling them mercilessly. Rome was done underestimating Spartacus. But Spartacus wasn't done either. His army continued to maneuver across Italy, raiding towns, defeating Roman detachments, and even attempting to negotiate with pirates in the hope of crossing into Sicily. For a moment, freedom seemed within grasp once more. A fleet could have carried them beyond Rome's reach. But betrayal struck. The pirates took payment and vanished, leaving Spartacus stranded on Italian soil. The rebellion was growing weary. Years of marching, fighting, and fleeing had taken their toll. Supplies ran low. Families struggled to keep pace with the army's movements. And cracks deepened between leaders. Some still demanded plunder, others revenge. Spartacus pushed for survival. Still, his charisma held much of the army together. He remained more than a general, he was a symbol. A man who had risen from chains to command a host that made Rome tremble. His very presence reminded them why they fought. Not for gold, not for conquest, but for freedom. But freedom was slipping through their fingers. Rome was tightening its grip. Crassus began to box them in, digging trenches and building fortifications to hem the rebels in like animals. For the first time, Spartacus's army faced the crushing weight of Rome's full might. And yet, even surrounded, the Thracian still fought like a lion. He broke through traps, shattered legions, and kept his army alive against impossible odds. But everyone knew the storm could not last forever. The rebellion was now a giant caught between hunger, exhaustion, and Rome's relentless advance. The dream of escape was fading. The dream of victory was fading. Still, one thing remained unbroken: Spartacus's resolve. He had led slaves against Rome and turned fear into hope, despair into defiance. He had humiliated the Republic, crushed praetors, defeated consuls, and made the Senate tremble. No matter how the end came, Spartacus had already written himself into history. But the storm was beginning to break. And as it did, Rome prepared to deliver its most merciless blow yet. The Senate had grown weary of humiliation. Year after year, legions had been beaten back, praetors disgraced, consuls shamed. Rome, the republic that had crushed kings and conquered continents, was being mocked by a slave. To the proud senators it was intolerable. To the Roman people it was terrifying. And so, the Senate gave command to Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was not like the others. He was no naive praetor, no careless consul. He was the richest man in Rome, a man who measured victory not just in glory but in ruthless efficiency. To him this wasn't merely a war. It was an investment, and failure was not an option. The first thing Crassus did was restore discipline to the Roman legions. Soldiers who had grown lax after years of easy victories and humiliating defeats now faced a commander who tolerated no weakness. When one of his legions faltered, Crassus revived an ancient and brutal punishment: decimation. 1 out of every 10 soldiers was executed by his own comrades. It was savage, it was merciless, but it worked. Fear welded Crassus's troops into steel. His men would fight to the death rather than face their general's wrath. Meanwhile, Spartacus's army, once a roaring river, had begun to strain under its own weight. Supplies were harder to find. Families burdened the march. And while Spartacus still inspired loyalty, the rebellion was not as united as before. Some clamored for escape, others for revenge, and some had simply grown tired of war. Crassus seized the moment. With methodical precision, he marched his legions south, forcing Spartacus into the toe of Italy. Then came his boldest move. He ordered a massive trench, 30 miles long, dug across the width of the peninsula, fortified with walls and stakes. It was a prison built not of iron bars but of earth and sweat. Spartacus and his tens of thousands were trapped, cut off from supplies, hemmed in by Rome's might. For the first time the rebellion faced starvation. Hunger gnawed at the camp. Winter winds cut through the mountains. Hope began to wither. The great storm Spartacus had unleashed was finally cornered. But Spartacus was not finished. In a desperate gamble, his army gathered wood, brush, and anything that would burn. On a stormy night, they set fire to a section of Crassus's fortifications and, under the cover of chaos, forced their way through. It was a miracle of defiance. Once again Spartacus had slipped from Rome's grasp. Yet the escape came at a cost. Many were lost in the attempt, and the army that emerged on the other side was weaker, hungrier, and more divided than before. Still, Spartacus refused to surrender. He turned his army north again, seeking one last chance at freedom. But Crassus pursued relentlessly, refusing to allow the rebellion to scatter. Every day, every march, the noose tightened. And then, as if the gods themselves wished to seal Spartacus's fate, word came that Pompey the Great, fresh from his campaigns in Spain, was returning to Italy. The Senate ordered him to aid Crassus in crushing the revolt. For Spartacus it was the death knell. Facing Crassus was already a nightmare. Facing Crassus and Pompey together was impossible. The Thracian knew it. His men knew it. Time was running out. And yet, in this darkest hour, Spartacus revealed the depth of his resolve. Ancient sources tell us he refused to flee, refused to beg for mercy. Instead, he gathered his men, urging them to fight not as slaves, not as fugitives, but as free warriors who would choose their own deaths rather than accept Roman chains. The walls were closing in. But Spartacus would not go quietly into them. He prepared for one last, desperate stand. A battle not for victory, but for immortality. The year was 71 BC. After nearly 2 years of victories, escapes, and defiance, Spartacus stood on the edge of destiny. His army, once a tidal wave of more than 100,000, was now battered and weary. Supplies were scarce, morale was fractured, and Rome's grip was tightening from every side. On one side loomed Crassus, ruthless, unyielding, his legions hardened by fear and discipline. On the other, Pompey the Great, Rome's golden general, returning from Spain with fresh troops and an eagerness to claim the glory. For Spartacus there was no longer any path to freedom. No road north, no sea to cross, no allies to call upon. Only battle. But Spartacus was not a man to fade quietly into Rome's shadow. If he could not win, he would at least die on his own terms, sword in hand, facing his enemy. Before the final confrontation, ancient writers describe a moment that has echoed through history. Spartacus brought forth his horse, the steed that had carried him through countless battles. Then, in front of his men, he killed it. "If we win," he declared, "I will have all the horses I need. If we lose, I will have no need of one." It was not just a gesture, it was a vow. He would not flee. He would not abandon his men. He would fight until the last breath. When dawn broke, the battlefield came alive with a terrible roar. Spartacus's army, ragged yet unbowed, hurled themselves at the Roman legions. They fought with a desperation that stunned even seasoned soldiers. Former slaves, shepherds, deserters, women who had carried burdens along the march, all now fought side by side in a final act of defiance. The clash was brutal. Roman discipline and formation met the raw fury of an army with nothing left to lose. Spartacus himself was everywhere, at the front lines, cutting down centurions, rallying his troops when they faltered, driving them forward like a storm given flesh. Some sources say he broke through the Roman line and came within sight of Crassus himself. Imagine it, a former slave charging toward the richest man in Rome, hoping to cut off the head of the empire with his own blade. He never made it that far. Wounded, bleeding, surrounded by enemies, Spartacus fought on his knees, still swinging his sword, refusing to surrender until he was finally overwhelmed. No body was ever recovered. Perhaps he was lost among the countless dead. Perhaps his men carried him away in secret. Or perhaps, as some like to believe, the earth itself swallowed him, sparing him the humiliation of capture. What we do know is that Rome wasted no time in making an example. 6,000 surviving rebels were captured alive. Along the Via Appia, the road from Capua to Rome, they were crucified one after another, their bodies stretched across miles. Travelers walking the highway would see them dangling on crosses, silent reminders of what happened to those who defied the Republic. It was a message of terror. But was it victory? Rome had crushed the rebellion, yes. Crassus claimed the credit for the final battle, though Pompey swooped in to take political glory by mopping up stragglers. The Senate breathed easier, the landowners reclaimed their estates, and the Republic restored its illusion of order. And yet, something lingered. For all their power, the Romans had been shaken to their core. They had faced Hannibal, they had faced foreign kings. But never before had they faced their own slaves rising in such numbers, with such ferocity. Spartacus had exposed the cracks in their system, the fragility of a society built on chains. He lost the war, but he won something Rome could never take back: a legacy. To this day, Spartacus remains a symbol. A man born without freedom who chose to fight rather than kneel. A reminder that even the mightiest empire can tremble when the oppressed refuse to remain silent. His rebellion ended in blood and crucifixion. But his story? His story lived on, whispered by the defeated, remembered by the oppressed, and retold by generations who see in Spartacus not just a gladiator, not just a slave, but a man who dared to defy the impossible. And so the question lingers even centuries later: did Rome truly defeat Spartacus, or did Spartacus plant a seed of resistance that outlived the Republic itself?